Atom Smasher turned out to be a pretty weak villain in the game, but there is one really interesting interaction early on in the story that a lot of players may have missed on their first playthrough. When you're at Konpeki Plaza with Jackie stealing the data shard, at one point you're almost caught red-handed and have to hide inside Yorinobu's room while Saburo Arasaka and Atom Smasher themselves enter the room as well. On first glance, it seems like you narrowly avoided being detected, but upon further inspection, that may not be the case. You see, there's an cyberware mod called a threat detector that, when equipped, shows any enemies in the area that are aware of your presence and outlines them in red. And lo and behold, if you have this equipped during the cutscene, you can see Atom Smasher clearly outlined in red, staring right at you and Jackie. Could this mean Atom Smasher knew the whole time? Were you set up from the beginning? Did Atom know Saburo was about to be killed? This would have major ramifications on the story of the game. Or it could just be that all the bosses in the game have a script that allows them to see you at all times for gameplay purposes. But let's ignore that, because that's not fun. For those that have traveled just south of Night City's interior, you surely have noticed this. It's a giant mass of greenhouses set up by Biotechnica that presumably is growing a majority of plant life and food to keep Night City afloat. What you might not know is Biotechnica is also known for animal cloning and creating lots of meats that we see in the game as well. And even more interestingly, they also have dabbed a lot in human cloning. Their human clone trials have proved partially unsuccessful so far though, as the clone bodies have no consciousness and are really just merely lifeless husks of meat, sometimes being implanted with low-level AI to give them life. So here comes the scary part. You see, Biotechnica is by no means a company that is good. Back in the 2000s, they helped many other corpos with black market deals, and now in present day, it is heavily implied that a lot of the food being produced in these greenhouses is in fact human. Scanning meat bags in the Maelstrom gang hideout from the All Food supplier, which gets its supply from the Biotechnica farms, you can see that 3.5% of the composition is unknown. What if that unknown material is actually human body parts? And we have more evidence too. Sector 4 of the Biotechnical Flats, for example, is completely shut off and gated in, not allowing any players in. What could be so secret to be hiding in there? And on top of this, we also have multiple shards and gigs that lend credence to this theory as well. In the Biotechnical Flats, for example, we can find a shard of an archived conversation between Tina Argon and Will Gunner, where they expand on details about black market proteins that no one really knows what is happening with them exactly. And also in the guinea pig gig, we learn about a Biotechnica executive who in her past experimented on many human beings that resulted in them dying, and more specifically, nomads. Now, if we come to the center of the Biotechnica Flats, we can actually find a small nomad compound. And here we find a smoking gun, a massive gravesite with only a handful of NPCs left alive and walking around, with many coming up to the graves and mourning throughout the day. In this town's small church, we can actually find a shard talking about how everything was fine, and then suddenly everyone started dying and disappearing. Using a little deductive reasoning, it isn't so far-fetched to assume Biotechnica may be up to something very dark here, kidnapping nomads that will not be traced back to anyone in the Badlands and using them for human cloning and meat production of human body parts that is eventually making its way into the Night City food supply. A damning proposition, for sure, if true. One of the lesser-known series of missions in Cyberpunk is the Imagine gigs with a Buddhist Zen master. You originally stumble upon this questline if you were walking through the downtown Corpo Plaza area, and more specifically in the gardens. Here you will find a Zen master who asks you for some money to take you on a spiritual journey, as he has seen something in you. If you accept, you're transported into a foreign jungle, the likes of which you see nowhere else in the game for the most part, And this series continues with you meeting this mysterious monk in many locations across the world, hearing his words of wisdom, and having your mind be transported to unknown locations in nature, each time with the monk disappearing when you come back to your senses. It's a nice change of pace from the chaos of the rest of the game, but it's also harboring some very significant ramifications. A big part of the Cyberpunk main story is about the idea of human souls and what it means to be human, about whether copying ourselves into new bodies is really us or some new sort of monstrosity. And the ending of this questline specifically has some big answers for us. You see, upon completing the last meetup with this monk, he once again disappears into oblivion. But this time, Johnny is now next to us, sitting and looking into the distance. When confronted about his thoughts on the monk and his visions, Johnny questions what you are even talking about, and it quickly becomes clear that he has not been seeing what you have. The reason this is so significant is this is the only time in the entire game where you and Johnny had this sort of cognitive dissonance. Through every fight and every cutscene, Johnny is with you along the way, and it is only on the journeys with this monk that he seems to remember nothing. These journeys through your soul. Sitting next to Johnny after the monk disappears are two objects, a Buddhist altar trinket and a small shard. The shard tells the story of a man telling his grandson the story of the Tower of Babel, which, for those of you who don't know, is a story of humankind building a tower to try and reach heaven to avoid persecution, which resulted in God creating multiple languages to spite them. And in this shard, the man tells his grandson about the different religions and atheism, and how they all wanted to answer one burning question: do we have a soul or not? It is strongly implied through this entire quest that, at least in Cyberpunk, we do have a soul, and that even a crazy terrorist man stuck in your head cannot take that away from you, and that maybe what these monks across the game world are studying is how to tap into our souls in a world that has become so soulless. This also would have implications for the ending and story beats of Cyberpunk, as it would confirm that those transferring their mind and body to new hosts and living on will still have lost what made them human, the soul. In fact, in one of Maximum Mike's radio discussions, he mentions that this monk master may just be Bartmoss wandering around in a new body, helping to offer guidance to lost souls, as we know others like Missy have seen this man from logs on her computer as well. The Perales storyline in Cyberpunk is a personal favorite for many in the community. You originally receive a call from Elizabeth, a woman asking for help, and upon meeting with her and her husband Jefferson in person, you come to the realization that they are in grave danger. And because Jefferson is running to be mayor, it's important that you get to the bottom of it quickly. You see, recently Jefferson awoke in the middle of the night and heard people inside his penthouse. He got his gun and tried to look around, but was immediately knocked out and doesn't remember anything else. Elizabeth thinks her husband is being paranoid and wants to help, but Jefferson is sure something is up. And as you snoop around their house, it is slowly unraveled that they have been monitored this entire time by a corporation they are now paying to protect them, SSRI, a lesser known and new protection firm, similar to Nightcorp. Hidden away in the middle of the Perales' home is a secret monitoring facility, where SSRI has been watching every move the Perales have been making. Someone is after them, and in an attempt to figure out who, you track down a van nearby that is sending a signal to the house. And when you get there, after clearing out a group of unknown bad guys, you hack into the van and discover that this unknown group is actually in the process of mind controlling the Perales. The reason they have been forgetting things and not feeling like themselves is because programs are being executed on their local chips to slowly transform them into puppets. You let Elizabeth know, and Jefferson, depending on what you choose to do, and the quest ends there, with a mysterious figure warning you over a call to stop looking into what you have discovered. But you see, at the end of the questline, you also may notice a man off in the distance staring at you. A man the Cyberpunk community affectionately calls Mr. Blue Eyes. This man has been watching you throughout the entire questline from different vantage points, and upon finding him at the end, he vanishes out of thin air. But we learn something about him from that short glimpse we get. Sitting on his finger is a ring that seems harmless at first. However, upon closer inspection, it becomes clear we have seen this ring before in many places. In fact, in some of the stories on this list before. Characters like Gary the Prophet, the monks praying to the magenta statue, and some higher level and shady characters we come across throughout the entire game. Furthermore, in one of the endings of the game, we actually get to meet Mr. Blue Eyes, and he tasks us with going to the Crystal Palace in space on a death mission, where the game abruptly ends as you float towards the structure. This man is clearly in the know about many things, and has friends in many high places and power we are not yet aware of. And the connections between the conspiracies of Cyberpunk and this blue-eyed man start to paint a picture that there may be something more going on in this universe. As stated before, Gary the Prophet and the magenta statues with the monks praying to them are all pointing to some sort of alien conspiracy on the net, or even Bartmoss, who is alluded to as having a golden ring of similar sorts to the blue-eyed man in one shard, claims aliens have taken over. Could this blue-eyed man, and all those with these rings of power praying to these mysterious statues, somehow be connected? Is there a conspiracy going on so grand in Cyberpunk that the entire future of the franchise could be dependent on it? It seems every important character is connected to this mystery somehow, and we may have some clues as to how when investigating the game's files for Mr. Blue Eyes. You see, his undershirt is actually referenced in the game files as man_average _Q115 _blackhand_D. The reason this is so interesting is because Morgan Blackhand is a main character from the original Cyberpunk tabletop lore, who took place in the Arasaka nuclear bombing with Johnny Silverhand decades ago. But in the game, we never meet him. Could Blackhand somehow be a part of this ultimate alien conspiracy, mind control takeover of the net that will result in the complete annihilation of the human race as we know it? Potentially a story for a future Cyberpunk game or DLC. Another quick addition to this overall conspiracy is how Nightcorp may be involved as well, and is likely the main antagonist in a future Cyberpunk sequel. Throughout the game, on multiple shards we can crack the security and discover that Nightcorp is using beaming tech on users' brains to install new personalities, and that they've also created a small and now becoming large drone army to work as docile helpers. We know from talking with the Voodoo Boys that the net is not as secure as it is being made out to be, and many rogue AI could potentially be taken advantage of to cause massive damage. And everything we can tell from Nightcorp is that they are trying to take advantage of this. So could Nightcorp be planning to win an all-out corpo war by controlling the minds of innocent civilians and using a supposedly docile drone army to overpower adversaries? We'll just have to wait and find out in future games. Dotted all around Night City are many weird statues varying in size of a weird frog-like creature with 4 arms and a sword. On first glance, it's semi-amusing and maybe points to Buddhist temples or some sort of deity that some of the Night City residents worship. But if we go to one of the biggest statues in the Corpo Plaza, we see this code in big lettering right on the statue. FF06B5. For anyone that doesn't know, this is the hex color code for magenta, and in fact, we can even find a magenta version of this statue in Japantown and across Night City, and this time with legs and a Buddhist monk's figurine with robes on. Which is a very interesting coincidence, considering this frog-like creature very closely also resembles Hindu and Buddhist gods, with multiple arms and the sitting stance. Specifically, Mangala, the god of Mars. And as we know, in Cyberpunk, Mars is a big fight for contention. We also find monks meditating in front of these statues at times. And all in all, this implies that something is going on with these statues and religious undertones, and with Mars. And in fact, later on in this video, we'll tie it all together in our final tier. But even more damning, we actually see these statues around many important shadow characters in the game as well. That further implies there is some sort of broader connection between the statues and a grand conspiracy in Cyberpunk. A lot of people have probably gone through Panam's quest for reasons. And one part of the quest line actually takes you through a small underground cave in the Badlands. And it's a pretty cool section, especially because it's the only time in the game we really get to go in underground caves like this, barring the Panam ending as well. What a lot of people don't know, though, is that in the game's files, and with modding and console commands, it's actually possible to find a pretty extensive network of unfinished and unpolished underground sections right beneath Night City. These sections are dark, damp, and devoid of any content, but they are there, and they certainly seem like they were intended for something at some point. In fact, during some of the radio station's commentaries throughout the game, there's one moment where we hear rumors of corrupted corpo vampires living underground in extensive cave systems throughout Night City. This sounds absolutely absurd at first glance, but it gets extremely interesting when we look back to one of the earliest leaks of Cyberpunk 2077 by a previously disgruntled employee. The developer noted a lot of things about the game and its progress that at the time were hated in the community, but turned out to be true upon release. And most interestingly, he noted one big piece of cut content the game was originally intended to have was an underground network of sewers and caves that was home to an army of vampire-like creatures similar to the vampires in the Masquerade Bloodline series. When we put all this evidence together, it starts to become very clear that this network of unused tunnels for sure was originally intended to house something. And that something is most likely an army of corpo vampires that kidnap and kill people to harness their strength. It's a pretty out there theory, but based on what we know about Cyberpunk and weird theories, it would fit right in. Maximum Mike and Gary the Prophet are the two most prolific conspiracy theorists in the game, and naturally, because of this, they have to make it onto my list. Mike is a man you always hear on the radio talking about crazy conspiracies and corpo wrongdoings, and Gary is the Co-Carnage lookalike right outside Victor and Misty's clinics, shouting about aliens nonstop. But the crazy thing is, what if they weren't so crazy after all? Throughout his quest, Gary screams to the public, letting them know that giant humanoid lizard alien monster men are taking over the net and coming into our world to take control of everything. You see, although Gary's questline can end in multiple ways, the most interesting for sure is the final one where he is kidnapped and his disciple takes his place. When questioned, the disciple notes that Gary was kidnapped by men in suits with blue eyes and taken to the mothership. This gets even more weird as we can actually see men like this throughout the game, even donning a specific ring on their finger that seems to denote that they are part of some shadow organization. Maximum Mike also alludes to this on some of his radio chatter about interdimensional beings that have taken over the net and are hell-bent on controlling the world. So what originally sounds like crazy nonsense from a detained man on the streets and on the radio slowly unfolds into something much deeper. We know from some shards in the game that there has been probes sent into space with the explicit intention of having aliens connect to our net in the Cyberpunk universe. And even some speculation in these data banks that aliens may have already found us. Even more convincing, Bartmoss, who we talked about before, had a book that he made about himself. And in that book, he talked about how aliens were likely already a part of the net. And as one of the most genius hackers of all time, if you had to take someone's word for it, it would be his. But if Mike and Gary's sermons are actually true, this would mean that interdimensional lizard aliens are more than just funny Alex Jones-like theories, and actually a part of by far the biggest conspiracy in Cyberpunk 2077. One that will likely play out in future DLC and hopefully lends credence to the idea that there are things much scarier than corporations in cyberspace. One of the biggest side plots in the Cyberpunk universe is about how many Night City residents are dealing with bouts of cyberpsychosis. Regina Jones even has an entire questline in the game dedicated to finding and dealing with these cyberpsychos, all in one effort to get more data on what is causing the outbursts. On the surface, it seems like it's simply individuals who have gone too far and augmented themselves to the point of madness, where they become more machine than man, and their body has extreme negative reaction to all the implants and drugs they're ingesting. But immediately off the bat, that makes us look to Maelstrom and wonder why so many of them lack cyberpsychosis. Some have gone insane for sure, but the vast majority we meet are just augmented bad guys that haven't completely lost their minds yet. If the theory about cyberpsychosis is correct, basically all of the guys in these gangs should be losing their minds. How are they able to be and form a coherent gang? Remember the cyberpsycho that attacked the mayor of Night City in River's questline? So if you investigate further into the dead mayor, you find that the cause of death was a spiked BD. Well, if V actually puts that spiked BD on and watches it, the sequence shares many visual effects with the Peraleses. And for those that don't know, we will touch on the Peraleses more in the next section. But essentially, they are being mind-controlled remotely by shadow governments and people. This means that BD spikes causing cyberpsychosis are resulting in the same odd outcomes as people being mind-controlled. Meaning, maybe all the cyberpsychosis is actually a lot more concerning. It might not be people going crazy with Chrome after all, but instead, people's augmented minds are being remotely taken over. In fact, in Judy's side job, talking about a revolution, Judy even remarks that her doll takeover chip that will enhance the dolls into fighters will make them feel like they are going through a cyberpsychosis episode. There are a lot of heavy implications throughout the Cyberpunk story that there is a lot more than meets the eye with cyberpsychosis, and that many of the people may actually be mind-controlled zombies, not just sad stories. Cyberpunk has a lot of different endings to the game depending on what you choose to do at the very end. But in my opinion, the coolest ending, maybe not my favorite, but the coolest is for sure giving up your body to Johnny Silverhand and taking the fight to Arasaka with Rogue and the old crew. The mission takes you on a helicopter ride through Night City, and it has you blasting your way through Arasaka HQ. It's non-stop adrenaline fun. But something many players may have missed at the start of this ending is the implications as to what Rogue has been up to. When Johnny first confronted Rogue at the Afterlife bar asking for help, he brings up the question of how Rogue is doing so well in the first place. Everyone else in the old crew that originally was a part of planting that nuclear bomb in Arasaka Tower is either dead or wishing they were. All except for Rogue. And in this scene, it is heavily implied that may be for a reason. You see, earlier in the game, if you continue down Johnny's side quest line, at one point, in an attempt to find and kill Atom Smasher, you find instead an Arasaka agent, Grayson. And while you may not know Grayson, Rogue, who is with you, certainly does. And Grayson even remarks on how he finds it funny that they are not playing for the same team anymore. These two instances heavily imply that Rogue sold out to the Corpo lifestyle after the fall of Johnny Silverhand, and explains perfectly how she was able to retain power and take over the Afterlife and become one of the most well-known fixers in Night City. especially considering Arasaka would have wanted her dead otherwise. Her being able to walk free is quite peculiar. This likely means Rogue turned against Johnny after his death, and only after seeing him come back to life through V's body does she realize the error in her ways and begin to once again fight against the Corpos. Even more damning though, some Corpo gigs in the game show that Arasaka and other corporations were being fed information by a classified fixer helping them out. Could this fixer be Rogue? And if it is, just how much power and leverage has she given the corporations in Night City over the past decades? The more you dig into this mystery, the more you realize the person that Johnny held so close may have done more harm to his cause than anyone he knows. Something very hard to come to terms with. Another interesting contradiction you most likely missed on your first playthrough of Cyberpunk is Johnny Silverhand's mysterious and missing blood types. You see, in the game when you see Johnny's dog tags, it's clearly labeled as him having 0 NEG blood type. But in the Never Fade Away mission flashback to his life before, when he was being helped by a doctor after being brutally attacked, you can see his vitals on a screen next to Johnny's body. And those vitals read Johnny's blood type as AB-RHD+. This could be an analogy to the scene in the Pista Sophia, where Johnny gives V the dog tags of a soldier who saved him in war. The soldier's name was Robert John Linder, Johnny's birth name. That man had to die for the legend of Johnny Silverhand to be born. But with the implication that his blood type also changed, this theory gets a lot more interesting. As we know, in many wars, fighters would be captured and experimented on in the Cyberpunk universe, with rumors of some even mutating enemies into entirely new organisms. Could Robert John Linder have undergone more than just a metaphorical death? And could Johnny Silverhand actually be the product of a war crime experiment gone wrong, that warped a man's mind and biology into something completely different? Just when you thought Johnny's life couldn't get any more tragic, there seems to be some light implications that it could be even worse. And in the world of Cyberpunk, nothing is off the table. Cold Mirage is actually an easily accessible gig in Cyberpunk, but one that a lot of people miss since it's off the beaten path. The mission tasks you with opening a freezer at a set of hidden coordinates, and when you arrive, you stumble upon what looks to be the body of Raish Bartmoss. For those that don't know, Bartmoss is regarded in Cyberpunk as the legendary hacker who took down the original net in the universe to stop corpo and government control. A genius and eccentric man, Bartmoss believed cyberspace was the real world, and took on Netwatch in a never-ending battle of wits, as well as assisting Alt Cunningham against Arasaka on the dime of Militech. He believed aliens and conspiracy were at the center of politics, and fought to reveal the secrets of this to the world. So finding him dead in a freezer in the middle of a landfill is a big moment. After all, this is the most well-known hacker of all time. And as the story goes, Netwatch was able to finally shut him down and kill him in cryogenic stasis, something that seems to be confirmed when you find the body here. But after searching the freezer, you find an old cyberdeck you can bring back to Nyx at the afterlife, and after he tries to hack into it, it actually fries his circuits and forces him to pass out, to which you have to save him. So what secrets is Bartmoss hiding on his deck? And more importantly, when we were at the freezer and scanned the body, why did nothing come up? Is this really Raish Bartmoss dead in the freezer? Or is this simply another game the famous genius is up to? Does he live in our real world to this day, or has his mind escaped to the net? It is implied in multiple data entries throughout the world of Cyberpunk that Bartmoss lives on in one way or another, with multiple hackers on the dark net expressing concern that recent ICE and injection protocols showing up on the deep net resemble some of the old work of Bartmoss. Either way, the legendary hacker in all of Cyberpunk's history most definitely has something else left up his sleeve. So this one and the last one are less of a conspiracy and more so confirmed, but a lot of people might not know about this one specifically. There's a rare line of dialogue you can hear at one of the gay clubs in the game where Silverhand confirms that he has swung both ways in the past. It's not surprising coming from a famous rocker boy, but it's an interesting insight nonetheless. Here, take a listen for yourself.
Last time I was here, I was with Carrie. This Latino hunk gave us a lap dance. Cheeks so smooth, I could almost see my own reflection.
I thought you preferred girls.
Mostly. Now and then I swung both ways.
For those unfamiliar with space travel, a mass driver is essentially just a massive platform that helps spaceships launch into space or orbit from the ground. And buried deep in the game files is actually such a structure. And even more curiously, it fits precisely into the currently existing spaceport in the game. This mass driver is assumably cut content for traveling into space or will be used in future expansions where we will get to travel to the Crystal Palace in space as V and discover it as an all-new zone. Either way though, it's quite obvious that CD Projekt Red has put a lot more thought into space travel in this game than we may have initially thought. And I am already hoping this idea comes to fruition in the future, because it's probably one of the coolest places we could possibly go in the Cyberpunk universe.